At my husband's funeral, my greedy daughter-in-law mocked my tears and accused me of being fake. What happened next, when the will was read, silenced her instantly, and I'm still shaking from the aftermath. I need to share this story because what my daughter-in-law Veronica did that day crossed every line imaginable, and the revenge that followed was so perfectly orchestrated by my late husband that even I couldn't have predicted it. My name is Margaret, and after 47 years of marriage to my beloved husband Harold, I thought I knew everything about the man I shared my life with. I was wrong, dead wrong. And the day we laid him to rest in Cedar Hills Cemetery here in Portland, Oregon, I discovered just how well Harold had been planning for this moment, watching, waiting, and preparing for the greed that would surface the moment his heart stopped beating. The morning of the funeral started like any other devastating day. I woke up in our empty bed, reached across to touch Harold's pillow one more time, and felt that crushing weight settle on my chest again. The weight that had been there since the doctor told us the cancer had spread too far, too fast. Harold had fought for 8 months, and I watched the strongest man I'd ever known waste away to nothing while our son Trevor and his wife Veronica couldn't be bothered to visit more than twice. I dressed in the black dress Harold had bought me for our anniversary 3 years ago. He always said I looked beautiful in black, that it made my silver hair shine like moonlight. As I fastened the pearl necklace he'd given me on our wedding day, I whispered to his photograph on the dresser, "Give me strength today, my love. I have a feeling I'm going to need it." The funeral home was already bustling when I arrived at 8 in the morning. Harold had been well respected in our community, a retired fire chief who'd saved more lives than he could count, and the turnout was going to be massive. I sat in the family room, greeting old friends and neighbors who came to pay their respects. Mrs. Patterson from next door brought me homemade cookies that I couldn't even smell without my stomach turning. Chief Rodriguez, Harold's old partner, held my hands and told me stories about Harold's bravery that made my chest swell with pride even through the grief. Then Veronica walked in. I heard her before I saw her, that sharp voice cutting through the gentle murmur of condolences like a knife through silk. She was on her phone, naturally talking loudly about some real estate deal she was working on. My son Trevor trailed behind her, looking exhausted and uncomfortable in a suit that seemed too big for him. My heart broke a little more seeing how much weight he'd lost since his father's diagnosis. While Veronica had been busy building her career, Trevor had been drowning in guilt over not being there enough. Veronica finally ended her call and approached me with what I can only describe as a performance. She threw her arms around me in an embrace that felt as genuine as a politician's smile, her expensive perfume overwhelming the gentle scent of the lilies Harold had loved so much. "Oh, Margaret, I'm so sorry for your loss," she said, loud enough for everyone in the room to hear. But her eyes weren't on me. They were scanning the room, taking inventory, calculating. I'd seen that look before. It was the same look she'd given our house the first time Trevor brought her home, mentally measuring square footage and estimating property values. "Thank you, Veronica," I managed to say, though the words felt like gravel in my throat. She pulled back and studied my face with those cold blue eyes of hers. "You know, Margaret, Harold wouldn't want you to be so dramatic about this. Death is just part of life. You need to start thinking practically about your future now." My future? 3 hours before we were even going to bury my husband, and she was already talking about my future. I should have known then what was coming, but grief has a way of dulling your instincts, making you vulnerable to people who mistake kindness for weakness. The service itself was beautiful. Harold would have loved seeing how many people came to honor him. The church was packed, standing room only, with firefighters from 3 different stations forming an honor guard. Pastor Williams, who'd married Harold and me nearly 5 decades ago, spoke about Harold's dedication to service, his unwavering integrity, and the love he'd shown his family and community. I sat in the front pew, holding Trevor's hand while he silently wept for the father he'd never quite understood, but always admired. Veronica sat on his other side, checking her phone periodically, and sighing dramatically whenever the pastor's voice rose with emotion. During the eulogy, when Pastor Williams spoke about Harold's final wishes for his family to remain united and care for each other, I caught Veronica rolling her eyes. The procession to the cemetery was long and solemn. Fire trucks with their lights flashing escorted Harold's casket through the streets of our neighborhood, past the house where we'd raised Trevor, past the park where Harold had taught our son to ride a bike and throw a baseball. I pressed my face to the car window and watched our life together scroll by like scenes from a movie I'd never see again. At the graveside, as they lowered Harold's casket into the earth, I finally let the tears come. They'd been building for weeks, held back by the need to be strong, to handle arrangements, to comfort Trevor. But watching that polished wood disappear into the ground, knowing I'd never see Harold smile again, never hear his laugh, never feel his arms around me during a thunderstorm, the dam burst. I sobbed, deep, wrenching sobs that came from a place so raw and broken that I didn't even recognize the sound as coming from me. Trevor put his arm around my shoulders, and I leaned into him, grateful for that small comfort. That's when Veronica decides to make her move. "Oh, for crying out loud, Margaret," she said, her voice sharp and irritated. "Those crocodile tears aren't fooling anyone. You're being ridiculous." The words hit me like a physical blow. The small crowd around the grave went silent, everyone staring at Veronica in shock. Even the pastor stopped mid-prayer. "Excuse me?" I whispered, unable to believe what I'd just heard. Veronica stepped closer, her voice getting louder and more confident. "You heard me. This whole grieving widow act is pathetic. Harold's been sick for months. You should have prepared yourself for this instead of carrying on like some tragic heroine. It's embarrassing." Trevor started to say something, but Veronica cut him off with a wave of her hand. "No, Trevor, someone needs to say this. Your mother is being dramatic for attention. And frankly, it's time she started acting like an adult. Harold is gone. Crying isn't going to bring him back. What she needs to do now is make some practical decisions about her future, starting with that house that's way too big for one old woman." The silence that followed was deafening. I could hear my own heartbeat, could feel the stares of everyone around us. Chief Rodriguez looked like he might arrest Veronica on the spot. Mrs. Patterson was clutching her husband's arm so tightly her knuckles were white. Even the funeral director, a man who'd seen every kind of family drama imaginable, looked stunned. But what hurt most was seeing Trevor's face. My son looked mortified, torn between defending me and avoiding a public confrontation with his wife. In that moment, I saw exactly what Veronica had done to him over the years, how she'd slowly eroded his confidence, made him afraid to stand up to her even when she was clearly horribly wrong. I stood there at my husband's grave, tears still streaming down my face, and felt something inside me harden like steel. This woman, this vulture who'd married my son for his potential inheritance, had just disrespected not only me, but Harold's memory at his own funeral. She calculated that I was too weak, too broken by grief, to fight back. She was about to learn how wrong she was. "You want to talk about being practical, Veronica?" I said, my voice steady despite the tears. "Fine. Let's be practical. Let's talk about Harold's will." I reached into my purse and pulled out the envelope that Harold's lawyer, Mr. Davidson, had given me that morning. Harold had insisted the will be read at the cemetery, right after the service. At the time, I'd thought it was an odd request, but Harold had been very specific about the timing. Now I understand why. Harold left very detailed instructions about how he wanted his estate handled. I continued, my voice getting stronger with each word. He also left some very specific messages for certain people. Veronica's confident smirk faltered slightly, but she recovered quickly. Well, of course he did. I'm sure he left everything to Trevor, as it should be, his son and heir. The way she said, heir, made my skin crawl, as if Trevor was nothing more than a conduit for her to get her hands on Harold's assets. Actually, I said, opening the envelope with hands that were no longer shaking, Harold had some very interesting things to say about you. Veronica, would you like me to read them out loud, or would you prefer to wait for the formal reading tomorrow? For the first time since I'd known her, Veronica looked uncertain. What are you talking about? I unfolded the letter, Harold's familiar handwriting blurring slightly through my tears. But I could read every word perfectly. Harold had made me practice reading this letter a dozen times in his final weeks, making sure I could get through it without breaking down. This is a personal message from Harold to his daughter-in-law, Veronica Mitchell. I began, my voice carrying across the cemetery. Veronica, if you're hearing this letter being read at my funeral, it means you've done exactly what I predicted you would do. You've shown your true colors at the moment when my family needed support and compassion the most. Veronica's face went pale. Margaret, this is hardly the time or place for. Harold's not finished. I interrupted, my voice sharp enough to cut glass. You see, Veronica, I've been watching you for the past 8 years. I've seen how you treat my wife, how you dismiss her contributions to our family, how you calculate the value of everything in our home every time you visit. I've watched you isolate my son from his family, make him feel guilty for spending time with us, and turn every family gathering into an opportunity to hint about your financial expectations. The crowd around the grave was completely silent now, hanging on every word. Trevor looked like he wanted to disappear into the ground with his father. I continued reading. I know you married Trevor because you saw potential dollar signs, not because you loved him. I know you've been pressuring him to ask about his inheritance, to find out how much the house is worth, to calculate how much you'll get when Margaret and I are gone. What you don't know is that I've been documenting everything. Veronica's hands were shaking now. This is ridiculous. Harold was a sick old man who... Harold was sharp as a tack until the day he died. I snapped, looking up from the letter. Sharp enough to hire a private investigator to look into your background. Sharp enough to record some very interesting phone conversations you had with your sister about Trevor's inheritance potential. Sharp enough to change his will 3 times in the past 2 years. The color drained completely from Veronica's face. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. I looked back down at the letter and continued reading Harold's words. Veronica, I'm leaving you something in my will. Something I think you truly deserve. To my daughter-in-law, Veronica, who has shown such keen interest in the monetary value of my family's assets, I leave the sum of $1. This dollar represents the exact amount of genuine love and respect you have shown my wife and me during the 8 years you've been part of our family. The gasp that went up from the crowd was audible. Veronica stumbled backward, as if she'd been slapped. But Harold wasn't done. Furthermore, I continued, to ensure that you cannot contest this will or make any claims against my estate, I am providing detailed documentation of your conversations with your sister Patricia, recorded with legal permission in Oregon, where only one-party consent is required for recording. These conversations, which took place on March 15th, April 3rd, and April 20th of this year, clearly demonstrate your intent to manipulate my son into demanding his inheritance early, your plans to convince Margaret to sell the family home, so you could access the proceeds, and your stated belief that Margaret is too stupid and sentimental to manage money properly. Veronica was shaking now, her carefully composed mask finally slipping completely. You can't do this. That's a private conversation between sisters. You can't. Actually, we can, said a new voice. Mr. Davidson, Harold's lawyer, had been standing quietly at the back of the crowd. He stepped forward now, his briefcase in hand. Everything Harold has done is completely legal. The recordings were made with proper consent. The will was properly witnessed and notarized, and the documentation is ironclad. He opened his briefcase and pulled out a thick folder. Mrs. Mitchell, your conversations were quite detailed. Shall I quote the part where you called Margaret a pathetic old woman who doesn't deserve to live in a house worth $500,000? Or perhaps the discussion about how you planned to have Trevor declared his mother's guardian so you could control her finances? Veronica's knees actually buckled. Trevor caught her arm, but the look on his face wasn't concerning anymore. It was horrible, pure, dawning horror as he realized what his wife had been planning. Mom, he whispered, turning to me with tears in his eyes. Mom, I didn't know. I swear I didn't know she was saying those things. I reached out and touched my son's face, seeing Harold in his features, seeing the good man we'd raised underneath all the confusion and manipulation. I know, sweetheart. Your father knew too. That's why he made sure you were protected as well. Mr. Davidson cleared his throat. The rest of Harold's estate, including the house, his pension, and all financial assets, are left in a trust managed by Margaret Mitchell, with Trevor Mitchell as the primary beneficiary upon Margaret's death. However, the trust specifically states that Veronica Mitchell can never access, control, or benefit from any portion of the estate. If Trevor and Veronica divorce, Trevor retains his inheritance rights. If they remain married, the inheritance passes to Trevor, but is held in a separate trust that Veronica cannot touch. The silence that followed was so complete I could hear the wind rustling through the oak trees surrounding the cemetery. Veronica stood there, swaying slightly, her perfect facade crumbling before everyone's eyes. This isn't over. She finally managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper, I'll fight this. With what money? Mr. Davidson interrupted calmly. The recordings I mentioned include your detailed plans to use Trevor's inheritance to fund the legal battle. Harold anticipated this as well. Any attempt to contest the will results in Trevor forfeiting his inheritance entirely, with the estate being donated to the Portland Fire Department's widow and orphan fund. Veronica let out a sound that was half sob, half scream. She turned on her heel and stalked away from the grave, pushing through the crowd of stunned mourners. We could hear her screaming at someone on her phone as she reached her car, her voice carrying across the cemetery like a banshee's wail. Trevor stood there for a long moment, watching his wife's retreat. Then he turned back to me, his face crumpled with shame and grief. Mom, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. I should have seen what she was doing. I should have protected you. I pulled my son into my arms, this man who was still my little boy, and held him while he cried for his father, for his marriage, for the family that greed had tried to destroy. Your father saw everything, Trevor, I whispered into his hair. He saw who Veronica really was, but he also saw who you really are. He knew you had a good heart that got confused by someone who didn't deserve you. As the crowd began to disperse, people approached me with a mixture of awe and sympathy. Chief Rodriguez shook his head in amazement. Harold always was 10 steps ahead of everyone else. He said, "Damn fine man, planning to protect his family even from the grave." Mrs. Patterson squeezed my hand. That was the most satisfying thing I've ever witnessed, dear. Harold would be so proud of how you handled that. But as I stood there beside Harold's grave, watching the funeral director and his team finished their work, I wasn't thinking about satisfaction or pride. I was thinking about the 47 years Harold and I had spent building a life together, the values we tried to instill in our son, and the way greed could poison everything it touched. The truth is, Harold's revenge was perfect. Too perfect. He'd seen Veronica's true nature years before I wanted to admit it, and he'd planned every detail of this moment with the precision of a military operation. He'd known exactly what she would do, exactly when she would do it, and exactly how to make sure she faced the consequences. But victory felt hollow standing beside the grave of the only man I'd ever loved. That evening, back at the house that was now legally mine forever, Trevor and I sat in Harold's study, going through the rest of the documents Mr. Davidson had left. There were letters for both of us, words of love and encouragement that Harold had written during his final weeks. There were also detailed financial records showing every conversation Harold had recorded, every piece of evidence he'd gathered, every legal step he'd taken to protect our family. Dad was like a detective, Trevor said, his voice filled with wonder and sadness. Look at all this. He documented everything. The files were extensive. Screenshots of text messages Veronica had sent to her sister. Phone records showing calls made while Trevor was at work. Even photographs Harold had taken of Veronica going through our personal papers during a family dinner, thinking no one was watching. He loved you so much, Trevor, I said, touching one of the letters Harold had written to his son. He was heartbroken watching what she was doing to you, but he never stopped believing in the man we raised. Trevor was quiet for a long time, reading his father's letter. When he finally looked up, his eyes were red but determined. I'm leaving her, Mom. I should have done it years ago, but I was scared. Scared of being alone, scared of starting over, scared of admitting I'd made such a huge mistake. What will you do? I don't know yet, but I know I can't stay married to someone who could say those things about you, who could be so cruel at Dad's funeral. That's not who I want to be. 3 weeks later, Trevor filed for divorce. Veronica fought it, of course, but the evidence Harold had gathered made it impossible for her to claim she deserved anything from our family. The recordings of her conversations were damning, revealing not just her greed, but her complete contempt for the people who had welcomed her into their lives. She tried to spin the narrative, telling anyone who would listen that Harold had been a vindictive old man who'd manipulated his family against her. But too many people had witnessed her behavior at the funeral. Too many people had seen her true colors revealed in that moment when she thought she could bully a grieving widow into submission. The divorce was finalized on what would have been Harold and my 48th wedding anniversary. Trevor came over that evening, and we sat on the front porch swing Harold had built 30 years ago, watching the sunset and talking about memories. Do you think Dad knew how it would all turn out? Trevor asked. I thought about that question for a long time. Harold had been many things, but he'd never been psychic. He couldn't have known that Veronica would be cruel enough to attack me at his own funeral, couldn't have predicted the exact words she would use or the precise moment she would reveal her true nature. But he had known her heart. He had seen the greed, the calculation, the complete lack of empathy that drove every decision she made. And he had loved his family enough to prepare for the worst while hoping for the best. I think your father knew that evil eventually reveals itself. I finally said he just made sure that when it did, we would be protected. 6 months after Harold's funeral, I still live in our house, still wake up reaching for him, still talk to his photograph every morning. The grief hasn't lessened much, but it's changed shape, becoming something I can carry instead of something that crushes me. Veronica has disappeared from our lives completely. Last I heard, she'd moved to California, chasing some new opportunity that promised easy money. I don't waste time thinking about her anymore. Don't wonder if she learned anything from Harold's final lesson. Some people are capable of growth and change, and others are simply predators who move from host to host. Trevor is rebuilding his life, slowly but steadily. He's dating someone new, a kindergarten teacher named Sarah who brings him soup when he's sick and remembers Harold's birthday. She's everything Veronica wasn't. Kind, genuine, more interested in Trevor's character than his bank account. But here's what haunts me, what keeps me awake some nights staring at the ceiling. Harold's revenge was so complete, so perfectly orchestrated, that it makes me wonder what else he saw, what else he knew, what other plans he made that I haven't discovered yet. Last week, I found another envelope in his desk, sealed and marked for Margaret 6 months after. Inside was a letter explaining that he'd also been investigating our neighbor Mr. Thompson, who Harold suspected was planning to contest our property line after Harold's death. Harold had documentation proving that Thompson had been gradually moving his fence onto our land, inch by inch, year by year. Sure enough, 2 days after I found the letter, Thompson approached me with a proposal to settle our boundary dispute amicably. He had the same greedy glint in his eyes that I'd seen in Veronica's, the same calculating smile of someone who thought a widow would be easy prey. I handed him Harold's documentation without saying a word. He left my property and hasn't spoken to me since. How many other envelopes are there? How many other people did Harold identify as threats to my future security? How long will I keep discovering the ways my husband protected me from beyond the grave? Sometimes I feel like I'm living in a chess game Harold is still playing, moving pieces I can't see, anticipating moves I don't even know are coming. It's comforting and terrifying at the same time, knowing that Harold's love for me was so deep that he spent his final months not just saying goodbye, but building walls around my future. The most unsettling discovery came last month when I was cleaning out Harold's closet. Hidden behind his winter coats, I found a safety deposit box key and a note with an address. The box contained $50,000 in cash, a second set of house keys, and a letter explaining that this was my emergency fund in case anyone ever tried to force me out of my home or threaten my independence. Harold had withdrawn this money gradually over 2 years, small amounts that wouldn't trigger any banking alerts, and stored it where only I would find it. The letter included instructions for 3 different escape routes. If I ever felt unsafe, contact information for a private security firm, and the address of a safe house he'd arranged through his old fire department connections. What kind of threats had Harold anticipated? What scenarios had played out in his mind during those long nights when cancer kept him awake? How deeply had his protective instincts reached into imagining every possible way someone might try to hurt me? I've never told Trevor about the safety deposit box, never mentioned the escape plans or the security contacts. Some of Harold's preparations feel too dark, too paranoid to share with our son who's trying to rebuild his faith in people. But I keep the key in my jewelry box next to the pearl necklace Harold gave me on our wedding day. And sometimes I run my fingers over both of them, tokens of love separated by nearly 50 years, but connected by the same fierce devotion. The truth is, I'm grateful for Harold's foresight, even when it unsettles me. Veronica's cruelty at the funeral was just the beginning of what could have been years of harassment, manipulation, and legal battles. Harold's documentation didn't just protect our estate. It revealed the scope of her plans, the depth of her contempt, and the calculated nature of her attack on our family. But gratitude doesn't erase the sadness of living in a world where such protection was necessary. Harold spent his final months preparing for war instead of just enjoying our remaining time together. He died knowing that predators would circle our family, that people would mistake kindness for weakness, that his widow would need armor he couldn't provide in person. That's the real tragedy of Veronica's greed. It stole Harold's peace in his final days, forced him to spend precious energy on battle plans instead of love letters, turned his deathbed into a command center for protecting his family from human vultures. And yet, in exposing her true nature so completely, so publicly, Harold gave me something invaluable: the certainty that I was right to trust my instincts about her. For years, she'd made me feel like I was imagining her coldness, like I was being unfair or judgmental. Harold's evidence proved that my discomfort had been justified, that the woman who joined our family had been calculating our worth from day one. Now, a year later, I understand that Harold's funeral wasn't really an ending. It was a revelation, a moment when masks fell away and truth emerged like light through darkness. Veronica thought she was attending the burial of an obstacle to her financial goals. Instead, she walked into a trap that had been years in the making, sprung by a man who loved his family more than his own peace of mind. The will didn't just silence her that day at the cemetery. It silenced her forever, removed her voice from our family's story, erased her influence over Trevor's future. Harold's final gift wasn't just protection. It was liberation from the poison that greed injects into love. And somewhere, in whatever place Harold's spirit rests now, I hope he knows that his plan worked perfectly. His family is safe, his son is free, and his widow sleeps soundly in the house they built together, protected by love that death couldn't diminish, and revenge that still echoes in the silence Veronica left behind. If this story resonated with you, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more real-life stories that will leave you speechless. Drop a comment below telling me what you would have done in my situation. Would you have stayed quiet or spoken up?